This is just a real quick video on a letter from a Birmingham jail, which is a super significant correspondence written from King, really at the height of the civil rights movement that explains a lot of the things that are going on during that time period. There's another video that sort of gives you the historical background and context to, sort of the circumstances historically on like why King wrote the letter. So, I think you definitely need to rewatch that video in order to, again, sort of like better understand the significance of the points that King makes in this letter. So just the basics. Obviously, the author is Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., one of the icons of the civil rights movement, one of the most influential Americans ever. The date is 1963. Again, this is really kind of like the height of the civil rights movement. The purpose is really to respond to those that were critical of his tactics in Birmingham. Again, Birmingham was chosen as a place that they were pretty confident that their nonviolent tactics would be met by the local government officials with a pretty violent and strong response. So there were many people that were critical of King's tactics, sort of criticizing him for like provoking a response from the government. And this is really his response. And really, the target audience of this letter are religious leaders. I mean, its primary motivation is while King is imprisoned for his actions in Birmingham, he's basically shown a letter that's co-authored by several religious officials in Birmingham that are very critical of his tactics. And like his reason for writing this letter is in response to religious officials that really have criticized his movement, and more specifically, not what the movement stands for, but how he's going about like trying to sort of uh, respond to all of the inequality that African Americans are sort of being exposed to during this time period. And then it's also sort of targeted towards like white moderates. These are white individuals that, again, probably feel like discrimination and segregation and prejudice are wrong. But either, again, they're uncomfortable expressing that, or they, are uncomfortable with the tactics that King is using. All right, so here are the major points. Again, part of this letter is a direct response to those that said that King is too quick to resort to direct action, like boycotts, marches, demonstrations. Like, why don't you just negotiate, right? Was sort of a criticism of King and people within the movement. So one of his responses is that it's not like he just authorized direct action right away, that it was a very sort of like deliberate sort of process that led up to the use of like marches and protests and boycotts and things like that. That they went into Birmingham, they collected facts, they surveyed the scene, then they attempted to negotiate with government officials. That though there was some progress with local government officials, the progress wasn't enough. And then they went through what he referred to as self purification, which is really like training in nonviolent protest tactics, and then they resorted to direct action. So part of the letter is showing his critics that this was a well thought out sort of like decision and a well thought out process. It's also a direct response to those that are saying, "Hey, why don't you just wait a little bit longer, right? Just be patient. Just wait. It looks like progress is kind of gradually being achieved." In his response to those saying wait, is that the people often saying wait aren't the ones that have historically been impacted by all of these sort of discriminatory policies, and that people have waited long enough, and that direct action was needed to sort of like push negotiation further. That it was only through direct action, these protests, these marches, the boycotts, that government officials would be forced to sort of negotiate and to change. So King was super sort of critical and pretty strong in his response to those that were telling him just wait a little bit longer. Um, King spends a significant portion of his correspondence sort of delineating between what is a just and an unjust law, sort of talking about how like unjust laws are characterized by the fact that the majority make those types of laws that they themselves have no intention of following, only applying them to the minority, and then the minority really not having any voice in the creation of those laws. In King's mind, those laws are unjust, and it is right for individuals to not follow these unjust laws that are only impacting a certain group and impacting a group in which they have no say in the creation of those laws. So a lot of what King is talking about is sort of like civil disobedience, like not following, right? Choosing to boycott laws that essentially are what he deems to be unjust. And again, a lot of the letter reiterates his frustration with white moderates and religious officials. He argues he's actually in the letter more disappointed in the white moderate than he is like extremist members that might belong to a white supremacist group like the KKK. He understands that like nothing he's going to say or do is going to change the mind of someone in one of those white extremist groups. But like what he's disappointed about are the people that he believes, the white moderates, that like disagree with discrimination and disagree with the way African Americans are being treated, but just aren't really like strong enough to voice that, or are somewhat uncomfortable watching the boycotts, the demonstrations, and the protests. And again, are saying just wait a little bit longer, right? His frustration is with those people that he feels like actually do agree with him, but aren't willing to express it or support his like tactics. And his frustration is often also with religious officials, who again, it's like the major impetus for like writing this letter in the first place is, to respond to the religious leaders that are criticizing his tactics. And King's frustration is that, he doesn't understand how religious officials can't be more direct in their criticism of the policies that are allowing discrimination, that are allowing segregation, that are allowing prejudice, that these things seem to go against basic religious teachings. And he feels like these religious officials just aren't going far enough in the support of the cause of African Americans and their pursuit of equality and to an end to discrimination during this time period.